Hi, my name is Tara Hirebet and I'm the head of Asia Pacific for Contagious. And what we do is we track advertising and marketing innovation, emerging technology, and consumer insights and trends. And we share that with sort of brands and agencies. And the idea is that we make brands braver and we push them to do this top 1%, more progressive, more game-changing kind of work. I'm a consultant, so I do a mixture of doing editorial and writing about Asia and Asian sort of trends and marketing innovation, and collecting sort of editorial from Asia, as well as running innovation workshops, doing trend briefings on the latest sort of trends, and helping people with their brand and their content strategies. In terms of being a TCK and the background in that, I was born in India and I moved to Singapore when I was about 5 or 6 years old. So most of my family is in India still. I have some family in America, I have some family in England. So we're also a little bit scattered and TCK-ish as a family. I moved here, as I said, when I was 5 or 6. I've been going to international school since I was young. And so everybody around me has always been a third culture kid as well. In fact, when I went to United World College over here, I used to feel like the most boring person because I was born to 2 Indian parents and everybody there was really exotic and sort of half Dutch, half Filipino, half Lebanese, half French. So imagine that, feeling like the boring TCK in the TCKs is probably a new one. After that, I went to Canada to university. And I studied drama and English and stayed there for a little bit. And then I actually decided to get into advertising. So I moved to England and I did a degree in copywriting. I stayed in London for a while trying to shop my book around and get a job there. And after that, I came back to Singapore to work as a copywriter. And from there, I moved to China to work as a copywriter. Then I moved into market research and trends in China, where I shopped with Chinese people and hung out with them and tried to raid their lives, basically, and their wardrobes. And then I moved back to Singapore about 2-3 years ago. So lots of traveling, definitely. In terms of how I'm involved in TCK communities, I'm not. This is probably the first one that I'm really involved in and helping out with. In terms of where TCK has sort of been a part of my life, I think when I answer some of the rest of the questions, you'll see I kind of discovered that sort of a concept last year and actually tried to champion it through a work project that I did, because I thought it was incredibly relevant and a rich space for brands to sort of get involved in and play in. So let me get to the rest of the questions. So one of the first questions I know is, what does being a TCK mean to me, and do I sort of identify with being a TCK? So I think labels are very interesting because no one growing up called me a third culture kid or told me I was a third culture kid. It might have explained a lot and helped me out with the fact that I felt a little bit confused and didn't really know where my sense of home was. But no one ever called me that. So when you say, what does being a third culture kid mean to me? It definitely means something to me. It explains a lot, and actually the label helps a lot. For the first time, I think the label is not something that makes you feel trapped, but it's actually quite freeing because you realize there are lots of other people like you out there, and you're not just the only freak show. So being a third culture kid is bittersweet. I think it's wonderful because I grew up, especially going to an international school, where I think it was a bit of a utopia. You don't grow up with racism. And in fact, it's the polar opposite. If you're racist at an international school, you're the outcast because everybody else is a mix of different cultures and there is no right and wrong. And there is no fitting in because everybody fits in by really not fitting in. And I think there's something quite beautiful about that and quite utopian about that. And then when you go out and live in places that are different, like when I went to live in London, for example, there was racism against Indians. Like I got called Paki on your tube and I've never, ever experienced that at any point in my life. And it was a rude awakening to the fact that the rest of the world is actually not as much of a global sort of huggy teddy bear as my school was, to put it in a very Teletubby kind of a way. What I think being a third culture kid means is that you accept all cultures. You think it's natural that the world is multicultural, and it isn't necessarily that way. You think it's natural that there's no racism, and it isn't really that way. So you have some great ideals, to be very honest, and some very United Nations level ideals from a young age that you actually have as a natural part of who you are. So I think that's beautiful. It makes things very confusing, though, because what it means is that basically you also don't really know where you come from. And you don't really know where home is. And I know that that's a very common thing that you see across TCK videos, so I'm not telling you anything new. But the problem is you grow up feeling a little bit like either a fraud or like you haven't figured yourself out and everybody else has. And the truth is, there's nothing to really figure out. When you figure out that who you are is that mix, that homeless and yet complete global citizen of the world kind of a mix, then I think you realize that is your place in life, and that you're a very unique, maybe forward and progressive generation or breed, because there are a lot more kids in the world that are becoming third culture kids, to be very honest. The way we're globalizing and people are marrying different ethnicities and traveling a lot more and living in countries that are not their own. And so I very much identify with it. I now do, because I feel for a change that I had nothing to identify with. I just identified with the fact that I didn't feel Indian. I didn't feel Western, so to speak. I didn't feel Singaporean. I just felt like me, but nobody else felt like me. So I do identify with that. I think I answered part of the question as to whether TCK is the same as being a global citizen and why not. I think it is a bit of a mix. It's not the same as being a global citizen in the sense that you can be a global citizen by traveling the world, I think, by being a world traveler, working on business trips and going everywhere. That's not really the same as being a kid who's taken away from home at a very young age, or the original home, and put into a new one somewhere else. I think you have a very different kind of an upbringing, and that changes who you are as an adult. So you can be a global citizen having still grown up in the same place, I think, but you can't be a third culture kid unless you are either born to mixed parents or you are living and grow up in a culture that's different from yours. And I think that Singapore in itself is an unusual place because it's also a multicultural hot pot. So I think being a kid taken away from your original home, stuck in another place full of different cultures, then stuck in a school full of different cultures, yes, it's confusing and very enriching at the same time. And you don't realize how much you've learned, or actually how privileged you are, I think, till you grow up. In terms of sort of what is the role or responsibility of TCKs as adults, as citizens of the world, well, I think that, I don't know, I don't think I like the word role and responsibilities. I think one of the things is when you get a label, you feel a tendency to either be obliged to do something that seems appropriate for that label, or you feel like suddenly you've taken on some kind of a project for life, which I don't think you have to feel that you do. That's very personal. I feel otherwise, if you do want to take on a role and a responsibility, or you do want to do something, it's really about, well, maybe it sounds a bit mumbo jumbo, but I think part of it is spiritual, where you should be the best person you can be. You should champion multiculturalism and all the things that you have been exposed to and learned, and that wonderful utopia maybe that you've grown up in. Because I think a lot of people would be fascinated by that. Some might think it's naive, but that's sort of a great vision of the world to have. And that you experienced it and you lived it, you know, it's a possible version of the world to have, because it exists out there somewhere, even if it's in a bubble in an international school, or even if it exists inside you and you carry it everywhere with you. That's a great culture in itself. So I think that the only role and responsibility you have is to take everything that you have been given, the exposure that you've been given, the fact that you have grown up absorbing cultures very naturally that people get thrust into as adults and have to learn about, that you learn languages naturally and have picked up different kinds of languages that adults go to classes to struggle and to learn. So you're sort of this amazing, you know, sort of walking United Nations, and can champion a lot of what the United Nations does in your own life with your own children. Let's say if you have kids, which I don't, but I'm just saying. And I know lots of third culture kids that are coming out into the world, and it excites me, including my godchildren. They're half German and half Indian. And I am very thrilled to have them as my godchildren, because I feel that I resonate with them and they're going to resonate with the way I grew up as well. So I think that's quite cool. I also think our responsibility is to try and maybe even champion that through work a little bit. So when I discovered the whole idea of the third culture kid, even though I'd grown up as that, when I started to read about it in Dezeen and sort of, online on TCK sort of Facebook pages, which are great, by the way, beautiful resources. And I'm so glad that people are creating communities like that for everyone to be a part of. I think that we were doing a project basically on youth, and it came out of that where I felt that youth in general feel confused. I feel confused. I'm not really youth, I guess, but I do. And I think the confusion comes from a lot of people not understanding what third culture kids are, what very multicultural kids of today generally are, or mashups that they are, and champion these ideals in advertising and in visuals. And that actually just makes your population of consumers feel sort of exiled a little bit, or like they just don't actually, they feel that there's something wrong with them. And I think that that's not a healthy place for a brand to be in. So I think what was really great to do was to work with a brand on that and champion that. So I think that was a bit of my role and responsibility. I felt like I championed something that was close to my heart. And I also discovered a lot about myself that way too. And it was really about the fact that, you know, a lot of not just advertising out there, but we're really used to looking at culture as something that you fit into. And the reality is today, when you are exposed to lots of different cultures, you have to pick and choose the aspects of that culture that resonate with you and that agree with who you are as a human being. And so I think a lot of times when people look at third culture kids, they think they pick and choose culture like it's their wardrobe. When the reality is third culture kids have had to, more than anybody else, really constantly establish their identity. And because that's always adaptive and changing, because they absorb everything around them and make it a part of who they are, their identity gets messed with a lot. So it becomes deeply important that they're able to pick the aspects of culture that make them feel the most comfortable, because generally speaking, they feel quite uncomfortable with all the changes in their lives. So I thought that was a very interesting and enlightening project to sort of do. And I'm really glad that I championed that, I think, on a level beyond myself, but also it helped to make me discover who I am a bit more. How do we cultivate a global citizen mindset? I think the way to cultivate a global citizen mindset is to be immensely curious at all times, and to not just be curious to the level of just exploring a place on its surface, but really getting in there, really getting to know a person to a very deep level, and a culture and the local sort of aspects of a culture to a deep level. When I was in China, one of the things that I felt made me more of a global citizen, or showed my third cultureness, was the fact that I went to market research and I actually did something that most expats would never get the opportunity or privilege to do, just to hang out in Chinese people's homes, eat dinner with them, find out about mums and what scares them about their children the most, really understand the food safety scandals and all the things that we see in media at a very real and a very personal level. So being curious is how you cultivate a global citizen mindset, and being empathetic. Traveling around China and understanding how moms talk about their children and how they feel that if they feed them something, they would hate to wake up when they were 12 years old and find out that their kids are basically sick because of something they fed them when they were younger. That was one of the most horrific things I've ever heard. And going around China and doing market research made me cultivate a huge sense of empathy. And I think that is a beautiful global citizen mindset. If you are able to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else, no matter who they are, no matter what walk of life they're in, no matter if they agree with their ideals or not, I think you become a bigger person, and that's what a global citizen really is. I also think that being a global citizen means that you are open and that you are able to accept and listen to all aspects and attitudes of a person and their culture. And you can decide, obviously, whether you agree with that or not, but it's being able to listen to it and really try and understand it before making a decision. And that's a decision, not a judgment. So it's also being as far as possible without too much judgment, or working on yourself all the time not to have that sort of judgment. And I do that a lot, and I'm not great at it, and I still need to be better. So it's also realizing and being humble and realizing that you don't know everything about the world. Even if you're a global citizen, you never know enough about the world. And that's what makes you a global citizen, that you feel that you always need to learn, and that there's always a place and a space to learn, no matter how old you are and how much experience you have. And the last bit is, what one piece of advice would I give a third culture kid trying to establish their identity? I think that's an amazing question, because I have got children who are third culture kids, as I mentioned, and their parents are German and Indian. I am Indian, grew up somewhere else. And the other godparent, the goddad, is Indian and grew up in Japan. So I'm sure that's going to make for some very confusing growing up. But the advice that I give them is that they're now in a place where they kind of probably feel a little bit like the odd ones out in the freak shows, and to realize that their multiculturalism is going to touch those people's lives and make them learn things that they wouldn't have learned if they hadn't gotten exposed to my godchildren. I think the other advice I would give is to be the best person that you are, to live out your multiculturalism and your ideas, to show that openness, to show that adaptiveness. And in doing so, as cliche as it sounds, you do become the change that you want to see in the world. We want a world where that kind of dissonance isn't there, where people accept all religions, accept all cultures, and understand that there is an absolute world where we can live together in harmony in that kind of a situation. And third culture kids do. They live it every day in the schools that they grow up in. They live it every day in their lives. And I think that your idealism, or the idealism that we hold, is something that everybody could use a little bit of, and that our world could use a little bit of. So I just think that when you're trying to establish your identity, be open to the fact that your identity is that you don't have one, and that you are able to accept and absorb a lot of different identities. And in doing so, you are championing multiculturalism and kind of being a little model United Nations walking around in a way that nobody else can. So I would say embrace the confusion, embrace the chaos, embrace the richness of it all,